Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast Fenced In. You are here with myself, Ben Peggs, and Chris Mollard. You should know us by now, but for those that are new joining today, Chris and I are both two GB international fencers, and also coach and student. I look after Chris, and he looks after me in other ways. So we're a bit of a duo, and we've got today with us a special guest in psychology. We have Dr. Jonathan Katz. Jonathan is a high-performance psychologist specialising in sport and business. Jonathan was the British Paralympic Association National Psychology Lead for 10 years. He's provided psychology support of 4 Paralympic Games, 2 of which for Para-GB, headquarters psychologist and 2 as national governing body psychologist across both summer and winter games, whilst also delivering support at the Olympic Games in Sydney and multiple World, European and Commonwealth Championships since '95. Jonathan has been a trainer within the NHS and other executive settings for most of his career. Whilst being a world-class psychologist, Jonathan is also a fencing coach and aided individuals and teams to high-level success. Currently working with British Fencing's athlete development program to integrate an elite psychology model to its emerging young fencers, and even working with me as well. So an impressive CV there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, very much so. And not just working with you, but working with you at the Commonwealth last time around, where you won individual gold and team silver. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And despite despite Chris and Jonathan being in the same room, this is probably the first time really getting to know each other. So we're looking forward to a really good podcast today. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks guys for inviting me, and looking forward to see where our conversation takes us.
Absolutely. Chris, we did a little bit on psychology, didn't we, a bit earlier on in the podcast during lockdown, and you and I, it's something you and I both work on quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are various different elements of that. There are day-to-day bits. There are regular training pieces for your mind as well as your body. And, we both have sports psychologists. We're fortunate enough to have Dr. Jonathan Katz with us today. And I know that the work that I've done with my sports psychologist has been invaluable, and that's essential. How often do you guys talk? How often do you guys kind of work together or do something?
So at the moment in time, Jonathan and I tend to meet every fortnight. It's been something. Jonathan and I have worked together on and off for how long would you say it's been, Jonathan?
Our paths then first crossed at your first senior Commonwealth Games of England in 2010. So that would make it 10 years.
Absolutely. And in a few days' time, well, a bit more than a few days' time, I'll turn 30. So that would make it 10 years.
How amazing. And is that how you first started working together as part of the England team?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that's probably, we've probably seen each other around the British fencing circuit on a regular occurrence, but really got to know each other in that environment. And as I say, we've worked on and off depending on funding, availability, results, lots of different things. But certainly in the last, I would say, 10 months, probably to a year, we've been working on a very, very close basis. And actually, Jonathan was kind of an integral part in our campaign towards, or certainly my own individual campaign with the team towards Tokyo 2020. What I often find with psychology is that I think a lot of people are somewhat misunderstood about the idea of sports psychology. So, Jonathan, firstly, talk us through exactly in your mind what psychology is, and are there any misnomers, any kind of misunderstandings about what psychology is?
Certainly. Thanks for that, Ben. It's a subject which is quite broad and therefore difficult to be concise, which I'll attempt to do. One of the structures in sport is to divide the environment into technical, tactical, physical, and mental elements. Obviously, the mental elements being the psychological elements. Historically, psychology was used in a reactive sense when there was a problem or an issue or a concern or some crisis emerged. Then psychology would have been brought in to provide a remedy. Over the last 10 or 15 years, or possibly a touch longer, the idea that people can improve their mental skills in just the same way as their physical skills, technical skills, and knowledge base has resulted in psychology being more of a proactive component in the sporting environment, and is seen as a performance enhancement. So in essence, psychology done formally is where the athlete or the team's thought processes, emotional state, etc., can be integrated to complement their performance.
So you've obviously spoken about sports psychology over a longer period of time. Have you seen any big changes from when you started in this field to now with athletes?
Yes, I have. When I entered or was involved early on, the bulk of sports psychology, certainly in the UK, was one of mental skills training. For example, goal setting, concentration, motivation, etc. As time has progressed, those elements of performance have now been included in coach education programs for coaches to develop directly, and I think correctly, because coaches are working with athletes far more than most psychologists would work with athletes. What that's meant is psychology, in addition to working with those specific mental skills, also works with communication systems, organizational structures, and it can also move to a wider perspective. And what's very topical in the current circumstance is in the well-being of the person, not just the performance of the athlete.
I think it's quite interesting, actually, you talk about that kind of bit where you say it's not just about the ultimate performance, it's about the well-being of the human. And that's something that I've certainly seen a difference in personally through reading more on psychology recently. And it's not just kind of looking for the ultimate performance, but we know if you have a happy person who's happy in their everyday life and their surroundings, their performance on the piste or whatever other, even in business or whatever, tends to be better. And I also, it's really interesting that you kind of talk about the way psychology was used as a bit of a kind of like plaster years ago, as a kind of a reactive based kind of support. Well, we'll just put a plaster on that, we'll kind of fix that. Whereas now it seems very much let's get to the root causes and actually educate one and coach them to have a stronger skill set from the beginning, a bit like you would any technical work or tactical work. That's really interesting for me.
You asked earlier, are there any misnomers or what I would refer to as myths? And one of the myths is that somehow psychology or sports psychology needs to be done in quotes in secret away from the sporting environment, and somehow it's kept separate from the other stakeholders in supporting an athlete or a team. And I find quite the reverse. The more, if I can use the metaphor, the more the psychology is brought into the performance light, so to speak, and is made visible, I think it can have much greater benefits in for the individual person and the wider system or context that person or squad or team is working and training and performing in.
I think that's really, again, really interesting, because you kind of see that people are working in teams now. Even if there's an individual, you have kind of a staff around them, and the idea of all of those that team, that staff working in unison, something that you and I have talked about recently, actually makes life a lot easier for the athlete. And it also means that everyone's kind of working, excuse the expression, on the same hymn sheet. That, you know, if the coach is reinforcing some of the psychological work that you're doing with your sports psych in lessons and on the piste, it makes for kind of one generic voice, one kind of system, which for the athlete becomes a much more consistent theme. Well, I've certainly found it that way anyway.
Yeah, so it sounds like everyone's pulling in the same direction, which makes a lot of sense.
But it means there's a lot more onus on the other coaching staff as well to have more of an understanding about the different areas that are needed. I remember years ago, fencing coaches were just fencing coaches, but now fencing coaches have a quite a rudimental understanding of strength and conditioning and psychology and different things, because they have to. The sport has moved forward, and not only the sport, but actually sport in general has moved forward, where you do need that more rounded knowledge.
Yes, I'd certainly agree. And in the more sort of formal terms, to sum up that ethos, if you like, now with psychology and the wider sports sciences, is that in an ideal scenario, the support is systematic. So it's built into a program, therefore it's integrated, and it's integrated with the coach and as you rightly say, Ben, with the wider support team, be them S&C coaches, physios, etc. The final point I would add, certainly in fencing and other individual sports, is that I certainly place a real importance on the relationship with the athlete and coach. And that unit is very important. And if there's more than one coach, then if I would say two coaches, then the communication between the athlete and the two coaches and between the two coaches is similarly important. So in essence, the psychology, as I work, can support that relationship.
Do you find that there is a sport, or are there other sports that fencing seems really similar to in that regard? So, or possibly individual sports, possibly team sports. Tennis is one that comes to mind, but I could be totally off the beaten track with that.
The wide range of individual sports are frequently built around a coach-athlete relationship, and there may be more than one coach, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then around that, there is a wider team to help inform the design of a training program, to help monitor and then add intervention into that. And that intervention can be, for example, the psychologist directly with the coach or with the athlete. But it could also be that, as I've done at times, I've worked with the coach, and then the coach works with the athlete, because it informs the whole relationship. If that makes sense to you, Chris.
That makes sense. I think that is very interesting.
It's really interesting how to say that, working also with the coach as well, to kind of see, because I'm sure, and I know this now, having done a lot of coaching work for a few years now, and Jonathan and I's path crossed again, actually, when I was taking one of my coaching qualifications. Jonathan sat on the board to effectively examine me when I was doing which was great fun, but also at the same time nerve-wracking somewhat. But as a coach now, you can see how, and I can see how, that working with a young student, people differ greatly, and the approach has to differ. And there's one preferred way that I like to coach and deliver, but there are some that are less easy to come by for me. And sometimes it's good to kind of talk about how you can have different ways of talking to athletes and coaching them.
That's right. And I think there are those different styles, if you like, at how athletes want to learn. I did mention earlier that I would come back to a point. Certainly in national squads, it's quite likely an athlete might have a personal or individual coach. There may well be a squad coach and a national coach. The challenge of understanding the coach-athlete relationship at the more towards the elite end is quite challenging, because there are multiple voices, and sometimes if those voices are created discordant results, that has an impact on the performance, the coaching for the athlete. And similarly, if that is more agreeable or more in sync, then that has a similar effect.
You find sometimes that your role is more of a facilitator between these various people. I used to find this working in an office as a designer. You had me as a designer, you had the tester, you had the person doing Q&A, you had the product owner, you had the stakeholders, and it was like a 5-way tug of war, and everyone was pulling in a different direction. And do you sometimes find then that your role is to be there for the athlete, but also to make sure that everybody's pulling in the same direction and there is a single voice?
Absolutely. And in the introduction that Ben kindly provided, there was the work with the British Paralympic Association, for example, and also when I've worked as a lead psychologist with different governing bodies. One of the core features of that type of work is with the organization or the system, in order to be a sounding board from top down as well as from bottom up. So you're quite right, Chris. Sometimes the support is in giving feedback to and having perspective of the system and the effectiveness otherwise of the communication processes.
It sounds like you could almost say the glue that holds everything together. And also I can imagine everything in between as well. And not only being a support potentially to a national coach who not only has 12 athletes, if we take the idea of fencing, who could be on a British squad, but also then not only looking after and finding the best well-being and performances for those athletes, but also potentially having to work with 12 different coaches as well. And if you're greedy like me and have 2 coaches, then even more so. So I can imagine that can be quite challenging. But actually, we've never really seen something as challenging as currently the environment we're kind of living in. Jonathan, we wanted to kind of find out what you think the effects of COVID and its restrictions are having on people's mental well-being at the moment.
That is a question and a topic on a multitude of lips around the world, in person and virtually. I'll give my attempt to summarize what I see. The key for me is, if we're looking at sports people, athletes, etc., the first thought process I go to is, how big a part does that sport play in that person's life? So, for example, if you from in my head, you've got folks who might go to a club once a week, and they what I term recreational or social athletes, who thoroughly enjoy the sport and are very valuable to a sport, yet the time influence in their life is relatively modest in terms of the effect on their day-to-day life, but no less important for them. If you contrast that with a full-time elite performer who has built their life around their sport, around the training session, around the competition fixtures, domestic and international, then the restrictions are very significant, because all of their benchmarks that they use to organize and structure their time themselves, indeed how they plan other aspects of their life around their sport, are directly impacted, and as a consequence that can have quite a big effect.
Really interesting to kind of hear, as you say, breaking it down into those that are more recreational fencers and those that are kind of your elite performers. And actually, they're probably the next kind of couple of questions we would ask, which is, well, what kind of effects are they having on kind of your club fencers, your social fencers, your recreational fencers? And actually, how would that go on to kind of high performers as well? Because I'm sure the impact for both is somewhat significant in their lives, but may differ depending on their involvement in the sport. So how would you kind of see the difference between the two?
I think of the recreation fencers or athletes, and within that I'd include what I would term non-elite performance. So these are the athletes that will compete regionally and nationally and have a fair degree of investment in their sport. So the significance of the sport is important. So because of that, in psychology terms, that's what is termed a heterogeneous group. So it's quite a wide range. Therefore, the implications vary. However, if I were to distill 1 or 2 generalizations with that group from the elite performer, the athlete or athletes competing internationally on the world stage as a result of that, the non-elite, certainly the recreational folks, will have COVID and the risks associated with COVID, and perhaps the logistical challenges of how clubs are being restructured as a consequence of having a COVID secure environment, will will potentially look at that and consider, is that something they're willing or prepared to undertake and to go through? So in other words, that becomes a potentially an impediment, but certainly a factor to be considered in how they progress as a generalization. If I contrast that again as a generalization with the elite performer, then for me, it's a question of, and I'll phrase this in the first person, I want to get back training. So I'll do what it takes. And if that means I'll go through COVID secure systems, I'll wear a mask occasionally, I'll do socially distanced training, so be it. But I'm going to get out there and I'm going to train. So in that regard, those factors are seen as more as just another factor to be managed in order to train as that person would like to, as close to their usual way of training as they're able. One of the consequences of the lockdown, and I'm going back perhaps now 2 or 3 months, is that with the absence of training, I think elite performers, perhaps again a generalization, felt a real sense of loss, a loss of purpose, a loss of sort of function, if you like, a loss of structure. And that uncertainty can undermine perhaps the mood from time to time. So the desire to get back into the training hall, into a structure, into a routine, is not only advantageous from a performance focus, it's also very influential to well-being.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And you've sort of answered part of what I was going to ask in that last part of the question, because obviously, Ben and I, from February, really, actually, I mean, from the beginning of all of COVID happening and lockdown happening, and even if lockdown didn't happen right at the beginning, there was a feeling of, it not being necessarily a good idea to be in a training hall. I know I certainly stopped fencing before, lockdown happened, a few weeks beforehand. And exactly what you've described is where the desire came from to implement a training program, to implement, right, well, this week I'm going to do, or, in a period of 7 days, I'm going to have this much rest. I'm going to do these types of training sessions. I'm going to do so much footwork, so much blade work, fitness, strength, conditioning. And as you said, that helps to continue with the purpose, especially for fencers that have spent so many years moving in a certain direction, loving the sport, but also wanting to achieve something. Suddenly that's all gone, and it feels like, it's very easy to feel like, what's the point? Where's, what am I going to do now? And I've definitely had periods of feeling really motivated by training on my own, and other periods where I've, gone, right, oh, okay, another session. Why? What am I doing? Why bother? And then it's, it's not until you get reminders that really what direction you're moving in and how useful it is. I know definitely by getting back into fencing, I could feel the benefits of what I've done over that period of time, and that that was really invigorating. And I said to Ben only the other day, I've had some hits recently that I've never had before. That obviously things are paying off, and that's fantastic. Even though I'm fencing much less than I used to.
It's also that sense of community, right? It's the understanding that being around like-minded people and people who do the similar thing to you, that's quite motivational. It's quite invigorating, and I think that. You and I certainly kept each other motivated during lockdown, talking about a whole range of different things, even if it's just giving ourselves new challenges, like a lot of the running that you and I have been involved in, just to kind of give ourselves a bit of a sense of purpose, like Jonathan was talking about, because I think when you lose that direction day to day, it can be challenging somewhat.
And listening to that quite carefully, we touched earlier on mental skills and the importance of mental skills, and in this instance it's goal setting. And although for some people goal setting, when they hear that, they kind of have a deep sigh of not again, I've heard about goal setting again. What I'm hearing is how setting a goal and talking about a goal and sharing the experience of the process of going about that was actually motivational and helped connection and support and reinforced the relationship you have with each other. And when a mental skill is done really well, those are the sorts of outcomes that are possible. So that's an example, if you like, about a mental skill being used appropriately at a time when there were so many challenges. To use a well-used phrase, you were able to control some of the controllables in an environment where many things had been removed.
Absolutely. And actually, I would go on further to say a little bit more on that, which is actually, I don't want anybody listening to this podcast to believe in any way that process was easy or without its bumps in the road, because it certainly isn't. I genuinely believe there's a difference between mental well-being day to day and performance mindset. And it just, that's my own personal kind of viewpoint, which is day to day, you can feel very content, or you can feel the opposite of the spectrum, and that differs greatly from what you kind of do as an athlete per se. And actually, there were a lot of times in lockdown when actually I wasn't very content. Things were very difficult. Things were very challenging. And Chris, I'm sure, had his poor ear chewed off on the phone a few times where I was groaning and mumbling. And even Jonathan was at the other end of the phone sometimes when I was talking about how difficult things were. But actually, we only kind of reflect on the kind of the highlights. And actually, because of potentially my age, along with Chris as well, we've been through some challenging times within the sport, and you know, we've had very supportive people around us like Jonathan to be able to kind of give us the tools to help. And so even though on the face of it, yes, we absolutely were able to make it through lockdown and gave ourselves new challenges and supported one another, and had a sense of community and a purpose, it still wasn't without its bumps in the roads and without its challenges. And there needs to be an understanding that actually you need to take care of your day-to-day mental well-being, as well as kind of giving yourself those performance goals and that performance mindset as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've spoken about how fencing or your sport is, a positive outlet and a focal point for things in your life. I know that's certainly how it started for me, and it was so helpful, so beneficial. You know, I had quite a highly emotional childhood, I'll say. Sometimes, you know, the emotion is there. So when the other stuff is stripped away, everything is quite bare and quite raw. And I know that finding something as a focal point definitely helped pull me through things. And, you know, Ben and I have spoken about this in the past as well, how, you know, relationships, you know, bad relationships in the past, or really struggling at work, you know, they're having something you get to enjoy and you can just switch off about.
Those comments add more poignancy to the conversation. And there's a very strong association with the potential value of, in quotes, appropriate exercise and activity in supporting well-being in depression and anxiety, for example. And the point here, a more general point, I think, for the audience, or as I anticipate the audience for the podcast being, is to understand what function does your sport serve for you, and is it meeting that function? So if there is a well-being function alongside a performance function, alongside a social function, then make sure you include aspects of activity that directly address those areas, the well-being areas, the social areas, and the performance areas.
Yeah, actually, and to touch on that point as well, is that I am a full-time fencer and I go to training every single day with usually a purpose, and something Jonathan and I have been talking about recently is having some renewed training goals and things like that. And we have been given a short break now whilst the FIE have looked to have a new kind of restart date. And as such, this is a good time to rest. But I'm also very aware that keeping fit and active is something in that keeps me very happy as a person. I always like staying physically active of some kind. I'm very aware that I need to rest as well. But after a few days rest, you know, I do enjoy still keeping fit and things like that. But also I still love fencing. And on Thursday this week, after a few days off, I do plan to go down to a local club in my area just to have a little tickle, you know, just because actually it's good to kind of put aside the training goals and the performance side of it, and actually just remember that I really like hitting people with a sword.
Yeah, we're very excited about being graced with your presence. And if it's not too much trouble, we can hit you back. That's all right, there.
Well, yeah, you are more than welcome. And to be honest, after my running at the weekend, I don't think I'm moving very fast. But and it's really good to talk about a sense of community and something that I think is has kept a lot of people connected within the sport. And as such, that kind of leads us quite nicely onto the British Fencing and its athlete development program. And British Fencing are doing a lot to bring through some grassroots level athletes through kind of England sport funding to progress the future. And Jonathan, you've been doing quite a lot of work with British Fencing in the ADP. Talk us through some of the work you've been doing with them.
The ADP, as you rightly say, has been in existence in its current form for about 3 or 4 years, perhaps a year longer or shorter. And the original function and purpose was to create an environment predominantly, but not exclusively, for cadet age and junior age athletes, where the if you like, the best youth fencers can be in the same place at the same time and can benefit from that environment and sparring with and training with, learning from people of a similar level, indeed better, and so on. And the emphasis is very much on creating self-aware athletes to become resilient performers as they go up the age groups. That brings me to, in part, where I've fitted into that, and there are 2 or 3 areas in that. One of the primary activity has been in the development of a bespoke sports psychology program for ADP, which would take the form of a mental skills toolkit, and that came about out of observations from several cadet and junior European and World Championships in understanding where are the GB fencers in relation to the best. And what is it that we're doing well that can be improved, or what areas are there that perhaps we can have some improvement in, and to raise the standards. The actual program itself has been developed and it's currently being prepared in the sense of developing the infrastructure to implement it. Alongside that, I will and I have delivered psychology sessions to groups of fencers at ADP camps. I've also played a part in supporting the ADP staff, and that's been in some of the areas we've spoken about before, in communication systems, organizational structures, etc., and also in bringing a perspective from my experience outside of fencing, and how some lessons identified in those settings can be used to add value to what we're doing within fencing. Because in any sport, there's a risk of becoming insular if you only look inwards from being on the inside. So having a little bit of a wider perspective can help to add new information and challenge existing thoughts to help grow and develop the environment. And the final part is, and occasionally I've done some mentoring with some of the ADP coaches, and also some assessments of coaches to become qualified, British Fencing qualified coaches, so that they can achieve their identified coaching qualification awards. Perfect. So that's a snapshot, if you like, of my role over the last 3 or 4 years within ADP.
That's a great overview. And actually working with a lot of the athletes on that program, is there any kind of common factors, themes that you see amongst the British fencers, strengths, weaknesses, anything in between, anything you've kind of recognized?
I think for me, there is huge desire, there's passion, and there's commitment across the board. If there's one area that I think, if it were enhanced a little, would have a significant pervasive effect across the system, and that's twofold. It's a twofold observation. The first is to challenge the notion of perfectionism, have a more adaptive concept of excellence, in which the standard of what's desired remains the same. However, the tolerance and ways of achieving it are more available and possible. Other is something we've spoken around, but not directly spoken about, and that is to have a purposeful approach to all aspects of training, and that means that I'm doing something for a purpose, and that purpose could be, to use an example you were just talking about, Ben, earlier, is going to have a tickle just because you enjoy the sport. Fun is a good purpose, and alongside that, and this is to reflect on what you've done and critically identify lessons that you can use to enhance performance. And by that I mean, it may not have gone as you intended, but that doesn't mean it was wrong. It meant it was different. Was it different, just different? Was it different worse, different better? If it was different better, what helped it become better, and how do I do that more? If it was different worse, what helped it get worse, so that I can find remedies, I can experiment to find alternatives to that. And ideally the ADP camps offers a space and time for fencers to experiment in order to learn without necessarily needing to perform and deliver an outcome.
So I find this fascinating because just the other day I was listening to a podcast called The Happiness Lab, and they've got a few episodes at the moment called Happiness Lessons of the Ancients, and this one was about Aristotle, and it talked about something similar. It talked actually about the scenario of a tennis match. One player wins, one player loses. You ask the losing player how he's feeling, and if following a certain mindset, the outcome is not the goal or the result. The outcome wasn't to win. The outcome was to prepare myself as best I could for this match, and then and that there's a feeling of satisfaction there because knowing that was the case. I found it slightly hard to relate to because I like to win, but I thought that the process was really quite good and fascinating. I was like, of course, if I there's no space to just be pissed off all the time. If you're losing, and if you're really taking a good approach, sensible approach, and kind of professional approach, I think there's a lot in that can do very much and do a lot for state of mind and well-being.
I quite agree. And one of the key themes in my work with folks is to challenge one particular style of thinking, which I refer to as an either-or style of thinking. So it's either this or it's either that. I look to think of it more as an and style of thinking. How that manifests in elite sport is there's a performance focus that's often results driven. There's also, to achieve the results and those performances, it's necessary to be able to have a resilient process to deliver one's optimum performances. If I think of that as an athlete as an either or, either I have to win or I have to perform well, but I can't do both. And I think that gets you into what I term a cognitive cul-de-sac or a dead end. My preference, therefore, is to have a set of expectations and goals around outcome, as you say, Chris, people like to win, and there's nothing wrong with liking to win, and there's nothing wrong with not liking losing. However, if I use the win or the loss as the only way of measuring my competence and my self-worth, then that's a very vulnerable foundation to build my self-esteem and my well-being on. Therefore, it's really important to recognize and acknowledge excellence of performance and process as well as outcomes.
I think that's really, for me, such a poignant area for discussion. I like the kind of way you talk about the idea of kind of perfectionism, and I think I can sometimes fall into that category, and it almost sounds quite self-righteous to say, "Oh, I'm a perfectionist," but actually it can be really quite emotionally draining to not be able to kind of recognize the small successes or the learning curve sometimes, because you're always trying to get things right all the time, and that's a very, very unrealistic expectation, and something I've had to learn to be kinder to myself on, with the idea that, you know, not something's not black and it's not white, there are many shades of gray in the middle, and also the kind of the idea of what success is, and whether, as you say, when you're competing, the outcome may not be exactly how you wanted it, but actually trying to recognize the successes still within that day, whether that is a good way of thinking, one particular action, a tactical choice, and not reacting to a referee, those kind of things. So the smaller kind of successes that are measurable. I like the idea that, as Einstein said, if the definition of madness is to do the same thing twice and expect different results. And so the idea of actually going to a competition, doing something, being unhappy with it, and then going back the next time and doing the exact same thing and thinking something will change. And actually then this, as you say, this learning kind of mindset of going, well, okay, I didn't get the outcome that I necessarily wanted. What parts of it were good? What parts of it were bad? And what can I improve upon for next time? And that kind of gives you a building block. And actually sometimes the things we choose to change, as you said, may not always give us the still desirable outcome, but at least there's been something that's been changed and it's given us more direction for the future, rather than getting caught in that kind of that loop as you were discussing.
I think a good way of thinking about this for me is the difference between lessons and sparring. I always used to think of lessons as the way you should fence. It's not at all. It's practicing scenarios. It's making, it's getting timing in, but like that doesn't mean that's how you have to fence. It's about hitting. Sparring is mostly about like being in the trenches and kind of, getting a light on, getting a hit on, and your lessons are about preparing you to do that in the best way possible.
I agree, Chris. In summary, for me, lessons is learning.
Lessons is learning. I like that. Lessons is learning. That might be the title of the episode.
Actually, the one thing that Jonathan does say, which I think is brilliant, is we've all heard the old adage of practice makes perfect, but actually Jonathan says practice makes permanent, which is a great way of saying that actually, if, as you say, you go to training without that purposeful approach, if you go to training and practice in a way that I'm just going through the motions, or you practice badly, those ideas become permanent. And they're therefore, when you're in the, as you say, in the trenches in the middle of competition, you're going to revert back to those things that you've purposely practiced. And if they're bad habits, there would be your permanent actions that come out. So I think, yes, a great kind of way to summarize. But there's obviously quite a lot of detail there for you personally, Jonathan. And obviously this is a very in-depth topic where there's a whole spectrum of things that you see, and working within high performance, what kind of gives you your personal motivation and your personal drive? And given you're working with athletes that are putting themselves under huge amounts of pressure, or within environments that are huge amounts of pressure, how do you deal with the pressure of what you do for a living?
I do like a nice, simple, straightforward question. There's nothing like a nice, simple, straightforward question. In short, one of my key drivers, if you like, or motivators, is to see people grow in whichever sense that is. And if I'm able to offer or play a small part in that growth, then that is something which I find motivating and sustaining. And as something you'll know, Ben, is I take that even to the point of when I've been a coach at Commonwealth Games, for example. I've said to people who I don't normally coach something along the lines of, if the best thing I can do is to leave you alone so you can do what works for you, tell me and I'll happily leave you alone. In other words, intentionally not doing something is every bit an intervention as doing something that's planned.
Yeah, completely.
And so for me, it's that helping and seeing people progress, and it's the relationships that come out of that set of experiences that are incredibly powerful. The pressures are enormous, and one way I try to summarize that in my experience from games, Paralympic Games, is I refer to it as a 25/8 environment as a support staff. To give you an idea, in the games where I was working as headquarters psychologist for Paralympics GB, my role potentially was supporting, for one games, around 360 people, for another game to touch over 400 people, and to deliver a service that needed to work the first time, every time, because you don't get a trial games to go and practice. So for me, it's having great support from colleagues. I spoke before about reflecting. I kept a reflective diary for all the 4 games I went to. Every evening I wrote down, or I typed into a file, a reflective diary of that day. I had colleagues in the games that I spoke with for that purpose. I had colleagues and friends out of the games at home who were outside of that pressure cooker space as a way to, who understood it but could provide support. And even at the games, building in time for me. So all of the advice around challenging one's own thoughts, looking after one's own mental well-being, taking time for rest, recovery, relaxation are crucial certainly in the sporting venue, in a camp, but also for longevity over time. I've been working now in psychology for far too long, about 34 years, of which about 25 in sports psychology at an elite level. And it's having a blend and balance of the sport, but also sometimes saying no when I want to say yes, because I need to say no for well-being reasons, even though for ego or other reasons I might want to say yes. And I hear that in athlete choices as well as coaching choices and other colleagues. And that's something that is somewhat easier said than done.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I fully on that one. Being pulled from pillar to post, just because you want to be there, so you can't give all yourself all the time. And as you say, they're 25 hours and 8 days a week. They don't exist, but sometimes you feel like you have to kind of put that work in. So along those lines, speaking about having been to the Paralympics, the Olympic Games, something that I think most people in most sports or sports staff and support areas would love to attend. What was it like being a coach within the Olympic setting?
There's a metaphor that's used about the games, which is it's a roller coaster. And I've not been an athlete at the games, although I have been an athlete at the championships. And the single big difference is, as an athlete, you focused on your schedule. Mm-hmm. So when the date is of your competition. If you've got more than one event, those dates. You prepare your training around that, and once it's done, you're finished. Good, bad, or indifferent, you're done. As a support staff member, you need to be on an optimum performance in delivery terms and support terms, with the first support at the preparation or holding camp, and the last training session or the last competition session of the games. And in one of those games, I was with the sport the morning of the closing ceremony. So that was a final event where there was British involvement.
It was non-stop.
Wow.
So it's unremitting, and your mood picks up on the mood of the performance around you. You may be aware, for example, that in the village, I'm assuming it's still done, in the athlete village, in the headquarters area, there's a medal table for GB and all the sports and all the days, and all the medals are noted down, and it's a very public space that people can't help walking past. And I think that's intentional, as this is why we're here. Imagine you're someone that hasn't contributed to that medal table and you're passing it every day.
Challenging.
Imagine you're someone that is targeted in your sport to be one of the favorites to podium or gold medal, and you towards the back end, and you walking past that and seeing your day come nearer and nearer and nearer, day by day by day. That's the kind of remitting demand of the external manifestation of the games, which is that medal or gold medal. And my job as a support staff member is to help with colleagues in the way I've described, insulate all of those, what I term extraneous demands, from the performance. And remember, I'm not immune to those demands as a human being and as a person. So I need to minimize putting my emotions onto the athlete or the other folks I'm supporting, whilst insulating them from the demands themselves.
That pressure is always so challenging. Certainly, I know what it's like when you say you've got somebody who's set to medal, and even if they potentially miss that medal, they then have the kind of, especially people around them are medaling. It becomes an even more difficult pressure situation. I remember, if we take it back to Australia for me, and I felt I was in a good position to try and win a medal in 2010, and it didn't go that well. And you and I sat outside and had quite a deep conversation about the pressures that I'd been feeling and how I now had to pick myself back up for the team and also be around those who were winning medals around me. That was particularly challenging. And then 4 years later, missing an individual medal and then going on to do very well in the team. Again, there was that conversation of a challenging individual picking oneself up for the team. And then finally, another 4 years later, it all came good, and both the individual and the team medals came. And it just showed that was, kind of 12 years of work between both of us, and having to kind of deal with the highs and the lows and the ups and the downs of sport. So, but all of that being said, what's your personal career highlight?
I've been asked this before, and I could pick up several. The one that stands out, which is one that is invisible in a directly performance terms, is that I was at a World Cup. There was a qualifying event for London with a sport, and we were in the States, and it was extremely hot. This was a Paralympic sport, and in summary, heat and disability do not mix very well, because there are complications of what's termed thermoregulation by athletes who have a disability. In other words, they can't cool themselves down as effectively as non-disabled people can. At the tournament, it was hot, and we saw the temperature forecast, and one day the ambient was going to be 100 degrees in the shade, and then indoors a bit more. We understood, all the athletes, what they needed to recover from a heat point of view, from a refueling point of view, from a food, etc. point of view, and so on. We had a bespoke program for each athlete. The coaches, team manager, physio, and myself worked as a unit with other athletes helping out. We created and bought all the resources to be able to have ice for external cooling, appropriate foods for refueling, hydration, very, very clear protocols. The thing that was magnificent is the athletes were able to deliver optimum performances in the events. Parallel to the athlete support programs, we also had support team programs. So we buddied up, and we each looked after each other. So we made sure that no one collapsed under the pressure in the environment. And it's one of those rare occasions where what we planned manifest as we intended.
Rare. They're rare.
It's a rare. And why that stands out is it was the manifestation of 4 years of work with that staff team, with that sport, piecing together all the lessons we've spoken about from different events that came together in that way, and that was particularly satisfying.
That's always the kind of the golden pot at the end of the rainbow, is trying to all the habits, everything, all of the learning, putting it into one program and it all coming good. It is certainly a rarity, and that's amazing to hear. For the fencers and for the sports people out there that are trying their best to find ways to develop and continue to grow with lack of competitions, obviously it's a great time to learn more, to do more work on oneself. Is there any kind of techniques, exercises you would suggest, or any kind of apps and other resources that people could use to be working on between now and when competitions do start?
I'm not familiar, and I personally don't use that many of those resources. I have seen some, but I am not sufficiently familiar to recommend them, and I don't want to offer poor or ill advice.
Okay.
However, what I would suggest is take this opportunity to review your fencing career, and if you've got a prior sporting career as well, and identify in 3 main questions. What are the factors that help you do well and why? What are the factors that help you do poorly and why? And what are the things you've never tried but you think, actually, this is missing from what I've ever done, and how can I introduce some new things? So identify the strengths and look for ways to reinforce and evolve them. Understand the areas that are no longer helpful and look for ways to disengage from them, and if needed, replace them. If not needed, allow them to remain dormant, and then be creative and seek advice from people around you for things which you don't know. In other words, take the things you don't know that you don't know and encourage yourself to be creative and curious to turn them into things you know you don't know, and that will help you to be able to plan so that when training becomes more systematic and we get back to competition, what you have will be an upgraded, updated process and plan circa 2020, 2021.
Perfect.
Awesome.
And
yeah.
that's a really good way of looking at things. You don't need to necessarily jump on any app store or books. Just a lot of this you can be done yourself with piece of paper and a pen and finding your own way through.
Yeah, I think that's very true. As a side note, you know the guy Andy that does the Headspace app? My daughter found on YouTube the other day something where I heard this guy's voice, and I was like, "What the hell's going on?" And he does a Sesame Street one with like animated Sesame Street characters. It's called Monster Meditation. So amazing. I just thought I'd mention that. It was really funny.
Yeah, we're big fans of Headspace. As a kind of final bit, Jonathan, it's been great to have you on. We've really enjoyed talking to you and finding out more about psychology and about your career and kind of what gives you the driving factors and what people can be doing to improve oneself. What's the biggest thing you've learned in your career?
If you create opportunities, be them the environment, the relationships, people have the capacity to learn, grow, and change. That does not mean they will necessarily achieve whatever the stated outcome goal is. However, give people an opportunity and the space to grow, and they may surprise you and do just that.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really like that. Yeah. It's a bit like fencing. Just make the opportunities and you'll hit.
Unless the other person messes it up for you.
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
That's very true. No, great. That's very clean and concise, and actually stops the pressure mounting on the individual. It's about growth and that person learning and developing, which is great to see. Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and you've answered some of our questions beautifully. And I'm sure the viewers will have a lot to take away and learn from themselves. Jonathan, where can people find you if they want to get in contact with you and set up sessions with you, or even just have a bit of a chat?
Thanks for the opportunity, Ben. I believe in the associated information with the podcast, there will be a LinkedIn connection. There will be a Twitter handle and an email. Yeah. So folks can get through to me on any of those measures, and happy to have a conversation. And I'd like to thank both of you guys, Chris and Ben, for the invitation and opportunity to have this conversation.
Absolutely, we could have sat here and spoken to you all day, Jonathan. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll definitely put the appropriate handles within the write up for the podcast. Remember to subscribe and review and get in contact with us as well on whatever platform you use. We like to hear from everybody and our viewers, so make sure you get in contact with us on our Twitter account, which is at the Fenced In Podcast. Or you can even contact myself or Chris personally. So Chris at Design J4G, which is on Twitter, or myself at Ben Pegs, or even my Ben Pegs fencing page. I'm also on Instagram as Ben Pegs as well. So whatever media you really fancy.
Yeah, just search for Ben Pegs on Google. He'll come up. You won't miss him.
Yeah, there'll be some terrible pictures of me. But in the meantime, I think that kind of sums everything up quite nicely.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Ben. Can't wait to meet you in person soon. And Ben, I will see you on Friday for our lesson.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, guys.
All right,
thanks.
See you later.
Thanks.
The Fenced In podcast has been created in association with J4G Design, your one-stop user experience agency for all things digital, websites, graphic design, and technical support.